The school bell rang sharply, signaling the beginning of another long day. Students rushed through the hallways, chattering and laughing, eager to see their friends and share their weekend stories. But among the familiar faces and voices, there was one who stood out: Malik. Malik was new to the school. He walked down the hallway, his head slightly lowered, carrying a worn-out backpack. His shoes were scuffed, and his clothes didn't look like the latest fashion. He didn't seem bothered by it, though. He walked quietly, keeping to himself as he moved toward the classroom. As Malik stepped into the classroom, all eyes turned to him. The students, already settled into their seats, couldn't help but stare. He didn't speak to anyone. His silence was almost loud, drawing attention in ways he probably didn't want. Some of the kids whispered to each other, "Who is he?" One girl asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "I've never seen him before. I heard he's the new kid. I bet he doesn't know anyone," a boy replied, laughing softly. Malik ignored the whispers. He wasn't here to make friends or impress anyone. He was just here to finish his schooling and move on with his life. He quietly walked to the back of the classroom and sat in the last empty seat. As he sat down, he noticed that the other students continued to glance at him. It wasn't unusual for the new kid to get attention, but Malik felt like they were looking at him for all the wrong reasons. He wasn't like the other kids. He didn't talk much, and he didn't laugh or joke around. In fact, he wasn't even sure how to start a conversation with anyone. He had learned long ago that it was better to stay quiet, keep to himself, and let the world move around him. The teacher, Mrs. Johnson, cleared her throat and began the lesson. She was a kind woman, but Malik didn't feel comfortable speaking up in front of the class. He kept his eyes focused on the board, pretending to follow the lesson while his mind wandered. The last thing he wanted was to be noticed. The more invisible he could stay, the better. But not everyone in the room was content to leave him alone. At the front of the class, two students, Jake and his group, whispered to each other, snickering. Malik could hear them, but he chose not to acknowledge their comments. "Look at the new kid," Jake said with a mocking smile. "He's so quiet. I bet he doesn't even know how to talk to people. What's wrong with him?" The others laughed softly, their eyes glancing toward Malik. He knew they were making fun of him, but he didn't react. The laughter wasn't new to him. In every school he had been to, there were always kids who found it easy to point out the differences in others. Malik had learned not to care. Words, after all, didn't hurt as much as people thought. It was silence that could make people uncomfortable, and Malik knew how to use that to his advantage. The rest of the day passed without much excitement. Malik kept to himself, staying out of the way as much as possible. At lunch, he sat alone at a corner table, eating his sandwich quietly. A few students glanced at him, but no one dared to sit with him. He didn't mind. Being alone was familiar to him. It was peaceful, and it allowed him to think. As the school day ended, Malik gathered his things and left the building. He didn't have any friends to walk with, no one to chat with about the day's events. He simply walked home, his head low, his thoughts to himself. It wasn't that Malik didn't want friends, he just didn't know how to make them. He had moved from place to place so many times that he had stopped trying to fit in. Each new school was the same. He would arrive, stay quiet, and wait for the day to end. And then he would move on. But as Malik walked through the gates of the school, he couldn't help but feel like this time might be different. There was something about this place. The way the kids laughed at him, the way they watched him. It was all so familiar, yet it felt different this time. He shrugged it off. Maybe it was just his imagination. After all, he wasn't here to make friends. He was here to learn and leave. The days at his new school passed slowly for Malik. Every morning, he woke up early, quietly got ready, and walked to school alone. The other kids didn't bother him much, but they still looked at him as if he were a puzzle they couldn't quite solve. He didn't mind. He was used to being different. The silence he carried with him seemed to speak louder than words ever could. On the second day, the teasing from Jake and his friends had continued. They would look at Malik and whisper loudly enough for him to hear, making fun of his quietness, his plain clothes, and his reserved nature. Malik ignored them. What was the point in responding to the noise around him when it didn't matter? He wasn't there to be noticed. He wasn't there to be part of the crowd. But one thing stuck out that day. It wasn't the teasing. It was a moment at lunch. Malik sat at his usual corner table, the place where no one ever came to sit. It had become his spot. He had grown used to the solitude, but today was different. A group of students walked in, laughing loudly and joking with one another. They saw Malik sitting alone, and for some reason, they decided to approach him. "Hey," a girl called from the group, her voice cheerful and curious. "Why are you sitting by yourself?" Malik looked up from his lunch, surprised by the direct question. He wasn't used to anyone talking to him. Usually, people avoided him, assuming he wouldn't want to talk. He wasn't sure how to respond, but before he could speak, the girl sat down across from him, her friends following suit. Malik raised an eyebrow. They were sitting with him? He hadn't expected that. The girl smiled at him, clearly seeing how awkward he felt. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked, tilting her head. "That's okay. You don't have to. But it's kind of lonely sitting alone all the time." Malik didn't know what to say. He wanted to explain that he didn't mind the solitude, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't sure if they would understand anyway. So instead, he just shrugged. The group of kids looked at each other, then back at Malik. They exchanged glances, as if deciding what to do next. Finally, the girl smiled again and said, "Well, we'll be sitting here from now on. You don't have to talk, but you shouldn't be alone." Malik couldn't help but feel a little warm in his chest. It was strange. He wasn't used to kindness, especially from people he didn't know. He nodded quietly, thankful for the gesture, but still unsure of how to react. For the rest of lunch, they stayed with him. They didn't pressure him to speak. They just ate, laughed, and occasionally made small talk. Malik didn't say much, but he felt comfortable. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the odd one out. Maybe it was just a small thing, but it meant more to him than they could ever know. As the day wore on, Malik began to notice something else. While the group had been friendly at lunch, the students who had mocked him before, like Jake, still kept their distance. It wasn't that they didn't notice him. They did. But they didn't tease him as much anymore. The next day, it happened again. Jake and his friends didn't laugh at him as they did before. In fact, they seemed almost nervous around him. It was as if they had realized something about Malik that they hadn't seen before. Maybe it was the quiet confidence that seemed to surround him, or maybe it was the way he didn't let their teasing affect him. Whatever it was, it made them hesitate. One afternoon after class, Jake approached Malik at the locker. He stood there for a moment, not saying anything, just staring. Malik was reaching for his books when Jake finally spoke. "You're different, you know that," Jake said, his voice lower than usual. Malik turned to him, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was enough to make Jake pause. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words. "What's your deal, anyway?" Jake continued. "You don't let anything bother you, do you?" Malik shrugged again. He wasn't interested in explaining himself. It wasn't like Jake would understand anyway. He had learned long ago that some people would never care to understand. But it didn't matter. He didn't need their approval. Jake stared at him for a moment longer, then walked away without another word. Malik returned to his locker, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the encounter. He couldn't help but wonder if something was changing. The students were starting to treat him differently, not with the same mocking laughter, but with curiosity. They didn't fully understand him, but they were beginning to notice him. It was the first sign of something changing in the way they saw him. But what did it all mean? Malik didn't know yet. All he knew was that he wasn't going to let their opinions affect him. He would stay silent, keep his head down, and let the world figure him out in its own time. As he left the school that day, walking home in the same quiet way he always did, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the start of something big. Maybe, just maybe, silence could be more powerful than anyone had ever realized. The days that followed felt like a strange shift for Malik. He had always preferred silence, finding peace in his own thoughts. But now, that silence seemed to make people uncomfortable. The whispers in the hallways grew quieter when he walked by. The teasing from Jake and his friends stopped, and the students who once avoided him began to look at him differently. Malik didn't know how to feel about it. He wasn't seeking attention. He just wanted to go through the motions of school, his own quiet world undisturbed. But something was changing, something he couldn't ignore. It all started in the classroom one afternoon. Mr. Thompson, the history teacher, was speaking about a topic that seemed to catch the class's attention. It was about the resilience of people who had faced hardships and how they fought back in silence, not with loud words but with actions that spoke volumes. Malik had heard these lessons before. It wasn't anything new to him. He had always been taught to be strong, to endure the hardships without complaining. His family had instilled this in him from a young age. But when Mr. Thompson asked the class to participate in a group discussion about resilience, something inside Malik stirred. The whole class was excited to speak, raising hands and offering opinions. But when Malik was asked, he hesitated. There was no reason to speak. He wasn't ready to share anything personal. Instead, he simply looked down at his desk, focusing on the words that danced across the page. Then, something unexpected happened. Jake, the boy who had always taunted Malik, spoke up. "I bet Malik doesn't have anything to say about this. He's just too quiet to say anything important," he laughed. The room fell silent. Jake's voice carried through the air like a challenge. The other students turned their attention to Malik, waiting to see how he would respond. For a moment, it seemed as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for Malik to either stand up and defend himself or cower in silence. But Malik didn't flinch. He didn't respond. Instead, he sat there, unfazed. The silence around him seemed to grow heavier, as if the air itself was waiting for him to speak. Mr. Thompson glanced between the two of them, but he didn't interfere. He was giving Malik space, letting him decide how to handle it. The tension was palpable, and it felt like everyone was leaning in, eager to see what would happen next. Jake, clearly expecting Malik to react, looked at him with an almost mocking smile. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue." The room seemed to wait for Malik's response. He could feel all eyes on him, their expectations hanging in the air. But he remained still, his face impassive. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, Malik did something that no one expected. He stood up, slowly, calmly. Malik didn't say a word. He just walked to the front of the classroom. There was something different about his movements, something that drew everyone's attention. The quiet that followed him as he walked to the front was almost deafening. It was as if the room itself knew that something powerful was about to happen. At the front of the room, Malik turned to face the class. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer. And then, finally, he spoke, softly, but with a weight that made everyone listen. "I don't need to speak to show you who I am," Malik said, his voice steady but strong. "Silence can be just as powerful as words." The class was stunned into silence. No one expected him to say that, let alone in such a calm, controlled manner. Jake stood there, his smile fading as he realized that Malik wasn't just a quiet kid. He was someone who had the strength to remain composed, even in the face of mockery. Malik didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back to his seat, his steps measured and deliberate. As he sat down, he felt the weight of the room's gaze shift. No one spoke. The class went back to the lesson, but it wasn't the same. Something had changed. After that day, the way the students treated Malik shifted. Jake, who had always been the loudest, didn't mock him anymore. The other kids, once indifferent, now looked at him with a sense of curiosity. They had expected him to react, to explode in anger or frustration, but instead, he had done nothing. That silence had been more powerful than any words could have been. And in that silence, Malik had become someone they couldn't ignore. The next day, during lunch, something unexpected happened. Jake approached Malik again. This time, he wasn't mocking. He wasn't teasing. Instead, he was quiet. His face was serious, his hands in his pockets. The other kids watched from a distance, unsure of what to make of this encounter. "You know," Jake began, his voice a little quieter than usual. "I don't get you. You don't fight back. You don't yell. You don't do any of the things that other kids do. But I respect that. You've got something I don't understand." Malik looked up at Jake, surprised by the unexpected compliment. But he didn't say anything. He just nodded slightly, acknowledging Jake's words without needing to respond. And in that moment, Malik realized something important. He didn't need to speak loudly or prove himself to anyone. His silence was his strength. The world could mock him, taunt him, and challenge him, but as long as he held onto his quiet strength, nothing could break him. As the lunch bell rang and the students slowly filed out of the cafeteria, Malik felt a quiet sense of pride. He had made it through another day, not by fighting back with words or fists, but by letting his silence speak for him. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the power of silence wasn't something that could be easily understood by those around him. But it was something he could hold on to, something that no one could take away. The weeks following Malik's quiet stand in the classroom passed by slowly, yet there was a noticeable shift in how the other students treated him. Where there was once mockery, now there was silence, an almost respectful silence. It was strange. Malik had always preferred being left alone, but now the attention he had gotten seemed different. It wasn't taunting or teasing, but a heavy curiosity that hovered around him. One afternoon, after his usual silent walk through the school hallways, Malik's peaceful routine was interrupted. It wasn't Jake this time, but a group of students from his grade. They had been following him for a few days now, watching him from a distance, intrigued by how he seemed to carry himself. They were waiting for him to break, to show some sign of weakness, but Malik never did. His silence remained his shield. On this particular day, as he walked towards his locker, he noticed the group standing nearby. They were staring at him, but this time their expressions were different, no longer mocking, but something akin to awe. "Hey, Malik," one of the boys, Sam, called out. Malik stopped in his tracks but didn't turn around. His back was straight, his shoulders tense, but there was no sign of fear or hesitation. He simply waited, unsure of what they wanted now. "We've been watching you," Sam continued, his voice softer than usual. "And well, we think you're kind of amazing." The words were unexpected. Malik had never really considered himself amazing. He was just someone who wanted to get through the day, to live in peace, but hearing this made him pause. He slowly turned around, his eyes meeting Sam's, who seemed to be searching for something in his gaze. We thought you were just a quiet kid," Sam said, glancing over at the others. "But you're different. You don't let things get to you. It's like you've got this power, you know." Malik stayed silent for a moment. He wasn't sure what to say. He didn't want to become the center of attention, but something in him told him this moment was important. He wasn't going to break his silence now. The quiet strength he had been building was too important to lose. "I just stay true to myself," Malik said softly, his voice calm but carrying a weight that caught everyone's attention. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Not with words, not with actions. I just do what feels right." The other students exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure of how to react. But Sam stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, a quiet respect in his eyes. "I don't know how you do it," Sam said quietly, "but I think we could all learn something from you." Malik nodded slightly, acknowledging Sam's words. He didn't feel the need to say more. He didn't need to explain himself. His silence was more powerful than any speech he could have made. The bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, and the group dispersed, but not before Sam gave Malik one last look. This time, it wasn't one of mockery or pity, but one of respect. Malik didn't know what had changed. It wasn't that the other students had suddenly become his friends, but something had shifted. They no longer saw him as just the quiet kid in the back of the classroom. They saw him as someone who was strong, someone who didn't need to shout or fight to be heard. His silence had turned into a form of strength that no one could ignore. The next day, as Malik sat in his usual spot in the cafeteria, he noticed something different. Jake, who had once been his biggest tormentor, walked past him with a slight nod of his head, a silent acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was a change. A small one, but a change nonetheless. Malik didn't react. He didn't need to. He wasn't looking for validation. But deep down, he knew that this moment, this shift in how people saw him, was the beginning of something bigger. Later that week, the most unexpected thing happened. It was during the final period of the day, just before the school bell rang, and everyone was preparing to head home. The principal, Mrs. Larson, came into the classroom, her presence commanding attention. She wasn't a regular sight in the classrooms unless something serious was going on. She walked up to the front of the room, looked directly at Malik, and then to the rest of the students. "I just wanted to acknowledge something," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "There's a student here who has shown incredible strength and resilience, and I believe it's important to highlight that." "Malik," she turned her gaze directly to him, "you've shown us all what it means to stay true to yourself, even when the world is trying to get you to react. You're a silent warrior, and that is something we can all learn from." The room was dead silent. Malik froze, his eyes widening in surprise. He had never expected anything like this. The principal was acknowledging him in front of the entire class. It was a moment he would never forget. "Let's all take a moment to learn from Malik's strength," Mrs. Larson continued, "and remember that sometimes silence speaks louder than words." As she turned to leave, the class erupted into a low murmur, some students clapping, others just whispering in disbelief. Malik felt his face flush, but he didn't say a word. His eyes scanned the room, catching the looks of his peers, looks of admiration, respect, and perhaps a little awe. For the first time, Malik realized that his silence had become a force to be reckoned with. It wasn't just about keeping quiet or avoiding conflict anymore. His silence had transformed into something that could make people stop and think. And in that moment, he knew that he had won, without ever having to say a single word. The next day, as Malik entered the classroom, things were different. The usual teasing and mockery were gone. Instead, there was a quiet respect, and though no one said anything to him directly, he could feel it in the air. The students no longer saw him as weak or invisible. They saw him as someone who had earned their respect without ever trying to prove anything. And for Malik, that was more than enough. The weeks that followed felt like a dream to Malik. He had never imagined that staying silent, never reacting to the teasing or harsh words, would bring him this kind of respect. It was as though the more he stayed true to himself, the more others saw his strength. They stopped seeing him as a target, as someone to pick on, and started seeing him as someone who deserved their respect. The school bell rang one crisp Friday afternoon, signaling the start of the weekend. Students poured out of their classrooms, eager to leave for the day, their laughter and chatter filling the hallways. Malik, as usual, gathered his things slowly, taking his time before walking out the door. He didn't rush. He never did. But today, something felt different. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed a few students hanging around the lockers near the entrance. Normally, they would have ignored him or sneered. But today, as Malik passed by, There was a shift. Several students, including some of those who had once mocked him, nodded at him in acknowledgement. It wasn't just polite. It was genuine. "Hey, Malik," one of them said, a girl from his math class. He glanced over, and she smiled at him, something he never thought he would see. "Great job on that math test," she added. "You really know your stuff." Malik didn't respond with words, as was his way, but he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. His silence spoke for him, louder than any words could. He felt something rise within him, something that had been buried for so long. Pride. Not in showing off, but in knowing that his silence, his strength of character, had earned him something more valuable than attention. It had earned him respect. He continued down the hall, not looking back, but he could feel the change around him. There was no longer the mocking laughter or whispers. There was only a quiet recognition of who he was. As he neared the exit, he saw Jake, the boy who had once made his life miserable. Jake stood with his friends by the door, looking at Malik. Malik stopped, his hand on the door handle, and for the first time, he met Jake's eyes. There was no fear in his chest, no rush to get out of there. Jake shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. He wasn't sneering anymore. In fact, his face had softened, and he looked at Malik with a kind of uncertainty, almost as if he was unsure of how to react. Malik stood there, silently, waiting. The seconds stretched on, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. "You're not like what I thought," he said quietly, his voice lacking the usual mocking tone. Malik didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence in that moment spoke volumes. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't require a response. Jake had learned something he couldn't take back. Malik had earned his respect without a single word. With a final look, Malik opened the door and stepped into the sunlight, the cool breeze brushing against his skin. As he walked away from the school, he felt free. Free from the weight of ridicule, and free from the need to prove himself. The silence he had carried for so long was no longer something to be ashamed of. It was his strength, and the world had finally seen it. As Malik disappeared into the distance, the students who had once mocked him stood there, watching him go. They didn't say anything, but they didn't need to. The silence between them now spoke louder than anything else ever could. Malik had won, without a word.